This week we continue to look at the 14th century. We're not going to look at the Black Death though, since we looked at that last week, but we will look at many of the other awful things that happened in the 14th century that leads it to be often called the calamitous 14th century. If nothing else, we can feel somewhat reassured that we do not live in the 14th century. Things suck right now, suck so much. I know that, and I know that things are so sucky for you. But take heart. We don't have the Black Death, and we don't have all of the things, other problems that were going on in the 14th century that we're going to learn about this week. Now, we're going to start off with need to know background, particularly the diet of medieval people. This ties us back many, many weeks ago to when we were talking about manorialism and manners and how the High Middle Ages was a period of urbanization. The population was overwhelmingly agricultural. 85% of the European population in the Middle Ages was a peasant. 90% of them lived in the countryside, but it is a growing chunk of people who were living in urban areas, that is, towns and cities. And that number is only set to rise after the Black Death for, well, I'm sure you can start listing the reasons already. Before we even get to the Black Death, though, this class is kind of like all the other crap stuff that happened in the 14th century. So we're actually going to go back to the year roughly 1300. We are then going to catch up with the Black Death, look at how all of these things actually played in together, and then look at how the Black Death made a lot of things that were already pretty sucky even suckier. So where we need to start is actually with what people ate, believe it or not. And this kind of helps us make sense of why certain things happened the way they did. So the medieval peasant's diet was pretty varied, but not very interesting, not very sumptuous at all. The main thing they ate was bread. And of course, we know about arable agriculture, that is crop growing. And we know that that was the main form of agriculture they practiced, with also pastoral agriculture as animal raising. But most of it was focused on growing grain, cereals of every type. The most popular was wheat. Then it was followed by spelt. But rye was also really common because rye will grow well, even in quite harsh conditions. Other things that they cultivated, barley, oats, hops. Later on, they had rice and buckwheat too. What peasants ate, though, was a huge amount of bread. The thing that they kind of had as their staple food, not that they were necessarily happy about it, was what they call black bread. And that was kind of 3 parts grain and 1 part beans, or maybe chickpeas or chestnuts. So it was pretty rich, good amount of calories. They could also kind of water it down into a form of soup. White bread, the Wonder Bread that we're all going mad for in the stores at the moment. Well, that would have been the preserve of the lords and the high ecclesiastics. If you're an ordinary person, you would have had wheaten bread. So this means that grain was a major part of your diet. 70 to 80% of your calories probably came from grain. So not a good time to be gluten intolerant in the Middle Ages. If you were gluten intolerant, you must have had a truly even more miserable existence. In general, though, a lot more vegetarian than us today. Soups, porridges, which are kind of like oatmeals, mushes, vegetables, fish, bread, cakes, pies, chickens. If we look at hospital accounts, though, we can see inventories of the foods that the sick people were given, and we can see that meat, eggs, and cheese were gradually increasing over time. So it was getting more protein-based, more nutritious by modern standards over time. Their main source of protein and calcium came from dairy, though. So this is why they raised a lot of cattle in medieval Europe. If they were going to eat meat, mutton was kind of the food of the poor. Pork was really popular. So the pigs were a lot bigger than ours today because the pigs were kind of more like the wild hogs that we have today than our domesticated pigs. Beef, not very little, not eaten very much because they got so many dairy products from cattle, so they needed the cattle for other parts. Also remember that male cattle, oxen, they needed them to pull the plows, so they were really, really valuable work animals. So you don't eat your work animals, and you don't eat the animals that are giving you cheese and milk and giving you a lot of your protein. Now, fish was really popular too. Now, think why. I'm going to pause for a minute and let you think, why would they want a lot of fish? So I hope you came to the conclusion, religious reasons. You needed to fast on religious days, and remember that in the Middle Ages, you're talking like a third of the year were religious days. So for a third of the year, you were not allowed to eat meat. You could have fish. Also, economic as well. Meat was expensive. You know, the cheap, widespread consumption of meat is a very recent phenomenon in societies. It's a real hallmark of late capitalist societies. So a lot of people ate the Middle Ages because of their religious beliefs. A lot of fish, they would have fasted. Another thing that they grew a lot of, not necessarily ate a lot of, were what we call legumes. No, we didn't eat legumes before. That's what we call peas and beans. They were not seen as a source of protein, although if they put them in black bread, that was pretty good calorie intake. But remember that they could use legumes for nitrogen in the soil. So it was a good crop to grow for crop production, also good for animal fodder. They also grew lots of other vegetables, very seasonal though, unlike today. Today we're like, you know what, I would like an orange or a banana, and we go to the store, and even if they are not growing here in Missouri, we can still get them. Even in this time of COVID-19, we can go to the store and get the fresh fruit and veg that we want. In the Middle Ages, you may do with what was growing and in season at that particular time. Fruit was grown an awful lot. We see lots of records of orchards. So things apples and peaches and pears and plums. The great thing about them was that you could distill them and make alcohol, particularly cider in the form of apples, and jam. So you could preserve it and consume it throughout the year. In the Mediterranean world, olive oil was like their go-to substance because you would cook with it. You would use it as lamp fuel. But in the north, they really didn't use it that much. In terms of drinks, water. The video clip that you're going to watch from YouTube shortly has one of these great myths. One of the great myths of the Middle Ages is that medieval people never drank water. They did. However, they were perfectly aware that water could be very dangerous. So they did not drink water that had, brown stuff floating in it, because even medieval people, they don't have our knowledge of germ theory, but they certainly weren't stupid, and they knew that if they drank water that had brown stuff floating in it, it was going to make them sick. So they tended to drink water from fast flowing streams. Not so much rivers, because the tanners could be, doing all sort of nasty things with the animal skins. But in towns and villages, wells were very popular. If you think back to last week when we mentioned about how these Jewish pogroms broke out, yeah, a lot of it got started because people started spreading the rumours the Jews were putting stuff in the wells and making people sick. And that reflects the fact that medieval people were drinking well water, and they were really paranoid about ensuring the purity of the source. So, Middle Age myth, they did drink water. But they also drank a lot of wine. They also drank beer, and they drank milk as well. In fact, wine was pretty indispensable. If you could afford wine, you drank wine because it was considered a strengthening and nutritious drink. The wine harvest took a real bad hit in the 14th century, which will have no doubt upset our medieval people a hell of a lot. Liqueurs were subject to very strict laws. They were produced by monks, mainly for medicinal purposes. The most common one by the end of the late Middle Ages, as we find it cropping up in the trades accounts, is being called aqua vitae. That's the Latin for water of life, but really it's probably like moonshine is what we would call it today. A very rough brandy, but I think, moonshine is the closest thing. Interesting to us today, medieval people were mad for condiments, by which I mean spices. Remember, there was the whole spice trade coming in along the Silk Roads as well. But they were also needed salt for flavouring the food, also for preserving food, because they don't have refrigerators or fridges or freezers in the Middle Ages. And, you know, to have a little bit of salt and black pepper on your table was a real social statement. So, you know, even, you know, towers had salt and pepper on most of the tables, some of the tables. You might not be able to get any salt or pepper out of them, but they had them there for display, and medieval people would have been well impressed with that, believe it or not. This is a fun link that I've posted here. I tried a medieval diet and I didn't even get that drunk. And it links back to when we were talking about universities recently. This was a person, don't do this at home, no matter how bored you are, don't try this. They decided to follow one of the medical textbooks from the medical school at Salerno, which we learned about the other week. And they followed their good healthy guide, lots of wine, but because they were eating so much stodgy food, they had so much soakage, they did not get that drunk. So it's kind of a fun read tying together what I was just talking about. So remember that diets would have been different depending on whether you were a noble or whether you were a peasant. So I've got a video clip from YouTube for you to watch, which is about what peasants would have ate. I like this picture of our peasants here because you see that, you know, they had knives. Knife would have gone everywhere with them in the Middle Ages. And that guy on the right is actually drinking out of a glass cup. So he's obviously got a bit of money. But I like the way they're eating bread and then what looks like a hamster on the middle, or roadkill maybe. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, we've got an elite banquet. They've got servants. They're being given a peacock to eat. Gosh, even the cat looks fat. The cat's eating well based on what they're dropping on the floor. It's a lot. That reflects that they had a much more varied, sumptuous diet. They don't have any little bowls with spices or anything on it, but if you look to the right, they've got lots of jugs there, and they doubtless have wine in them. That's probably their wine display, and that's their bar. So I want you then to, after you've looked at the YouTube video, you're going to then watch, have a read of a web page, which is about elite diet. I'll summarize it now for you. But elite people ate differently from peasants. In fact, because of the sumptuary laws, which were those laws which dictated what people could and couldn't wear, the other thing it dictated was what people could and couldn't eat. So things like salmon, that was reserved for the nobles, and then ordinary people wouldn't have been able to afford salmon fish anyway in the Middle Ages. Only the nobles would have eaten venison, so the nobles would have had their own diet. So this what the reading here, this link that I've got posted here, and I'll post it in the Nearpod as well, is we're going to come back to it a couple of times this week. It's from the research into King Richard III's skeleton. Now, if we were in class, I'd say, has anybody heard of King Richard III? And somebody might say, Shakespeare wrote about him, and he did, but he's kind of more popularly known now for being the parking lot king, or if you were in England, the car park king. They find him buried underneath a parking lot. And when they dug him up, they found, Shakespeare depicted him as being a hunchback, and indeed he had very advanced scoliosis. You're going to watch a video about that later. But they looked at the isotopes in his teeth and his bones. If there's any, in fact, I know there are biologists in the class, it'll be of interest to you. So what they did is they looked at the teeth, and that tells you what people were kind of eating in roughly the first 10 years of life as their teeth are forming. And then their bones are kind of roughly the last 10 years of their life. So they analysed the isotopes to see what he was eating since he was the king, and they found that he was suddenly eating a lot of very rich food, in particular a lot of meat, whereas before that he'd actually had a very vegetarian, frugal, fish-based diet, and they knew from the documentation that his coronation banquets when he became king were really, really obscenely ornate and really, really just too much, even by medieval standards, and they're showing off, and medieval people love to show off. So they could tell that, oh, well, look, this is when he became king, because the food that he ate was transformed completely. So those are the two links for you to look at next, and then the next video is going to be about famine and something we are actually familiar with today, climate change.